Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Nicholas Wilson in my capacity as Chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Nicholas, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
Welcome.
As you know, the conversation is being video recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media. You're carrying out this conversation with me on the basis that you have already provided written submission to the APPG's Call for Evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. Could I invite you, please, first of all, Nicholas, to tell us about yourself and outline, just briefly to begin with, how you came to interact with the Financial Conduct Authority? Thank you.
Well, yes, I've worked most of my life in the law, and I worked my way up. I never qualified because my background is music, but the law was always a job to pay the rent. But I ended up being head of department in doing debt recovery. And I acted for, my main client was the John Lewis Partnership, and they were very loyal clients, and they followed me to 3 different firms. And the firm I ended up at was a firm called Waitmans. But in 2003, Waitmans, John Lewis sold their store card business. It's like white labeling to HFC Bank, which is white labeling is where they might sell a washing machine or soap powder or something with their own name on it, Waitrose washing powder, but it's actually made by Lever Brothers or so. And it's just so they sold their store cards to HFC Bank in 2003, which also happened to be the time when HSBC purchased Household Finance Corporation. So HSBC owned the bank. And I had a meeting with the bank's HFC's head office in Windsor in 2003, and they told us, because I was worried we might lose the legal work because presumably they had their own solicitors, and their solicitor told me that we could carry on doing the legal work provided we did it on the same basis as their existing solicitors, which was a firm called Restons. I explained what that basis was, and I told him then that it was illegal what they were doing, and that was in October 2003, and to this date I have still been fighting this corruption and fraud still to an unsatisfactory conclusion. But to answer your question, involved with the FCA, in the end I blew the whistle on my employers, on Waitmans. I went to the Law Society, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and they confirmed what I had been saying all along, that the charges were illegal. But then nothing happened. The SRA did nothing. So it was in 2012 I reported, because I wasn't satisfied that I knew it was multi-million pounds involved, and nothing was being done about it. So I went to the Financial Conduct, it was the Financial Services Authority in 2012, in December 2012. And that was the beginning of my involvement. And then, of course, they became the FCA. So that's how I got there.
Thank you, Nicholas. What role were you in, and in what firm, when you blew the whistle?
Well, I was in a firm of solicitors called Waitmans, and I had been head of debt recovery. I guess at the time I blew the whistle. I mean, this was one of my grievances because I was complaining about the illegal contract. All the work was taken away from me, sent up to the head office in Liverpool. I worked in London. I had a team of 5 people, or four under me. And they were all made redundant, and all the work was taken up to. I was effectively constructively dismissed, and it was because I was complaining about the illegal contract. And as a result of that, I'm known on Twitter as Mr. Ethical, and that's because my employers used to refer to me as Mr. Ethical because I complained about these illegal charges. So that was my position, and I was head of debt recovery, and then it was all taken away from me.
Thank you. Did you follow your employer's whistleblower policy? And if so, can you provide a copy of your employer's whistleblower policy?
Well, no, they didn't have one. They made him now, but at the time, I mean, I wasn't really, because I was naive at the time, and I wasn't really aware of what whistleblower was. I knew that I was going to report them, and I went through the proper channels. I mean, I went to the partners. I complained to the partner. There was only one partner there that supported me, and he also emailed the other partners. Got no reply, got no response. They weren't going to deal with this. It was so lucrative. They weren't going to change the contract. So I reported them to the SRA. But I did. I mean, that is the correct procedure. First of all, you make an internal grievance, and then if it's not dealt with, then you go to the regulator, which is what I did.
Thank you. And when did you blow the whistle, and to whom, stroke which organisations? What age were you then?
It was 2006 when I blew the whistle. I was 49, and I blew the whistle to the Law Society, but at the same time, the Solicitors Regulation Authority came into existence, so it was then dealt with by the SRA.
Have you ever witnessed any actions or conduct that, in your reasonable belief, breached any law, regulatory code, or applicable or relevant policy? And if so, please explain which law, code, or policy you believe was breached.
Well, yes, it was the illegal charges. I mean, when the contract was explained to me by the bank solicitors, I told them there and then it was illegal, because I knew that in law you're not allowed to add contingency fees well, they added that it was a contingency fee, meaning that if it was a debt recovery matter, if we recovered £10,000, normally in a contingency fee arrangement, your fees will be paid out of that £10,000. But in this case, they were adding the fees onto the debt. So they were adding 16.4%. So on a £10,000 debt, they were adding £1,640 to the debt initially for writing one letter before action. So that was illegal contingency fees, and also solicitors are not allowed to charge for any matter which they're not allowed to claim their costs for anything which they're not entitled to. They're not allowed to claim costs until a court awards their costs. So they can't. And in fact, in those rules, it states even writing a letter for a debt, you can't charge for the price of the cost of that letter. But they were charging over £1,000 just to write an automated letter. So that's what I witnessed, and it's fraud. It's quite simply fraud.
I'm going to ask the next question, even though at least to some degree you've already answered it, and I'm going to ask it just in case you want to add anything further to what you've thus far said. What was the nature of the misconduct, infringement, malpractice, or so on that you alleged?
Well, it was fraud, pure and simple. There are various categories or definitions of fraud in the Fraud Act, and one is misrepresentation. The solicitors misrepresented that they were entitled to those costs. Unfair advantage. They were writing to unsophisticated debtors who would not have known that they were not entitled to those costs. And the bottom line is the cost. It was illegal. It was in breach of the Solicitors Act 1974, and it was strictly illegal. You can now, there is a thing called damages-based agreements which you can enter into, but even which is a similar thing to contingency, but even then you can't add your costs onto the claim. Your costs come out of the claim, not added onto the claim. So even if they were doing it now, it would still be illegal. So it's fraud. That's the bottom line. And
what interaction have you had with the FCA about the situation?
Right. So as I said, I reported to the FSA in 2012. Nothing happened. And it was then in early, I can't remember the dates, but after the FCA came into existence, I did a Freedom of Information Act request to the FCA, asking them what they had done with the complaint. I think it had been about 2 years since I'd heard nothing, since I first reported it. And then they, I'm not sure if I'm jumping ahead on this, but they wrote back in reply to my Freedom of Information Act request. They wrote back and said they'd done nothing, but they said that they didn't they hadn't done anything because the bank's contract or terms of agreement with the debtors allowed them to add these charges on. Now, at the same time, I and a fellow campaigner, Joel Benjamin, went to the HSBC AGM, and he asked the chairman, Douglas Flint, about these illegal charges and what the bank were going to do. He was brushed off. But Joel then wrote to the bank after the AGM, asking them what the position was. And they wrote back to him saying that the bank hadn't taken any action because the bank was entitled to add these charges according to the terms of the agreement. The letter that Joel got was exactly the same as the letter I received from the FCA. Punctuation, paragraphing, everything. It was a copy and paste from HSBC to the FCA. So the FCA sent it to me, HSBC sent it to Joel. So I'd caught them out. They were colluding in, and the answer was a complete lie. In 2010, the Office of Fair Trading had made an order against the bank telling them to stop adding these charges unless they changed their terms and conditions to allow them to add the charges. So it was 100% untrue. They were not entitled to add those charges. And the FCA were subject to a fairly tough grilling from the Treasury Select Committee about this. MP Jesse Norman questioned the chair of the FCA at the time, the CEO Martin Wheatley, and he said to Martin Wheatley, so what you were saying to Mr. Wilson was untrue. And Martin Wheatley agreed it was untrue, but they brushed this away by saying it was just an error of judgment. They apologized and said it was an error of judgment. They didn't accept that it was colluding with the bank to cover up this fraud. So that was the beginning. That was the beginning of my dealings with the FCA. They were covering it up, basically, with the collusion of the bank.
Did the FCA explain or define the extent of the regulatory authority to you in respect of the matters you were raising?
No, they ignored me, basically. I mean, up until that point, that they had ignored me. But it was after that that I became more involved in pursuing the FCA.
And what evidence, if any, did you give the FCA and or any other entity?
Well, I told them, I gave them what material evidence I had to show the charges. I had copies of claim forms and so on. I sent them a copy of the ruling from the SRA saying the charges were illegal. I sent them the ruling for the Office of Fair Trading telling the bank to stop it. I mean, the point was there had been these regulatory orders against the bank, the SRA against the solicitors, and the OFT against the bank. So there had been these quasi-judicial orders against the bank and the solicitors, but still the FCA didn't see it was a problem. I also dealt with the police, but we'll probably come on to that. But so you know, they wanted me to go away, and they treated me in that way.
Nicholas, what, if anything, do you believe the FCA could have done that may have prevented the matter that you blew the whistle on from happening in the first place?
Well, at the time I blew the whistle, the FCA they didn't have jurisdiction over Consumer Credit Act matters. That was dealt with by the Office of Fair Trading, and they did take action. Although, interestingly, I since subsequently found out through a complaint against the FCA from the Complaints Commissioner that in the OFT's investigation, they found 4 cases of these illegal charges. But I've since found out that also the man who conducted the investigation for the OFT now works at HSBC. But so at the time, and the FCA hid behind this because they said this is a historical case. We didn't have jurisdiction, but I was saying yes, but I'm telling you now. And the point was, I mean, it's not historical because a lot of the hundreds of thousands of people will still be paying these illegal charges because they're paying in installments. They're paying £10 a month or something, or they would have charges on their property. So it wasn't historical, it was ongoing. And I was telling the FCA, this is not finished.
To your knowledge, Nicholas, what did the FCA do to investigate the matter you raised?
Well, nothing. I've explained about the Freedom of Information Act request I gave and when they wrote to me and they wrote to Joel Benjamin. Um, and as I say, they denied that there was any collusion with the bank. But I've subsequently, over the years, done a direct subject access request to the FCA. Initially, they said they couldn't comply with it because there were 12,000 documents referencing me, but eventually I narrowed it down to a small area, a smaller time scale, and there was evidence in that the bank, both the bank and the FCA, were sharing my tweets with each other. You know, oh, Mr. Wilson has tweeted about this, and Mr. Wilson has tweeted. So they were colluding. They were working together to find out what I was doing about exposing the fraud.
To what extent did the FCA act promptly and effectively to investigate your allegations?
Well, they did everything they could to not to investigate them. I made a complaint to the complaints commissioner after they had I think I made they'd refused to investigate it, and I think based on this collusion with the bank, I made a complaint to the complaints commissioner, and he replied with I've added it, I've linked to his report on my questionnaire. He made, I think, a 10 or 12 page response, and he said in his subsequent annual report that it was the worst case he dealt with, because throughout they had made excuses, they had tried to put the blame on me for various things, they had they just were determined not to investigate it, and his report was so scathing that the FCA agreed to open an investigation into my report. But the first thing the FCA did immediately after agreeing to reopen the investigation, bearing in mind that the investigation was, there was a company, John Lewis Financial Services, which is a separate company but is owned by HSBC. At this time, HFC Bank didn't exist. In fact, HSBC surrendered HFC's banking license just a couple of months before the FCA took over jurisdiction of consumer credit matters. So there was, they made sure there was no question that the FCA would be able to deal with it. That was their thinking. Anyway, the Complaints Commission said it was the worst case he dealt with, and they agreed to reopen it. And the first act they did in reopening it was employ non-executive directors, one from John Lewis, which was Dame Margaret Hodge, I think her name, Baroness Hogg, anyway, from John Lewis. She sat on the John Lewis Audit Committee, and from HSBC, Ruth Kelly, who was an MP who resigned because she'd fiddled her expenses and she went straight to work at HSBC. Then the FCA employed her as a non-executive director. So the first act they did in reopening the investigation was appoint 2 directors from the people they're investigating onto their board of directors. So after the FCA had appointed these 2 non-executive directors, they held a public meeting which I attended, and I questioned Andrew Bailey. I said, because I had received after their first press release in 2017, they announced that the HSBC had agreed to repay £4 million, which I knew was ridiculous. So at the public meeting, I queried Andrew Bailey, and after that £4 million, which I knew, and the Guardian wrote an article about it, and I said these figures are risible. Somebody, and to this day I don't know who it was, but somebody unsolicited sent me a whole tranche of county court judgments, millions of them. I worked with a computer expert. It was raw data, which I wouldn't have known how to deal with. So I worked with a computer expert, and we analyzed the data so that I could break it down into the years relevant and the claims which would involve HFC Bank and John Lewis. Anyway, so I had all this evidence, and I said to Andrew Bailey at this public meeting, why is it that I seem to have more evidence of this fraud than the FCA and HSBC put together? And he sarcastically said, well, it's great that you've got so much evidence, but only you know how you got hold of that evidence. I mean, the important point is that they refuse to investigate. As far as I am concerned, when I report something like this to the FCA, they should investigate. They should. I had a meeting with Andrew Bailey, and I said to him, why didn't you raid the solicitors' offices? He said, we can't raid solicitors. They can apply to the court for, and this is a big complaint against the FCA. They seem unaware of their powers, but they can apply for a warrant in the magistrate's court to raid solicitors. But they didn't do any of that. He said that, you know, our dealings with this will be evidence led, but they didn't look for any evidence. I had to provide all the evidence, and in the process of doing so, I was, you know, I was accused almost of doing wrong myself.
Thank you. And just for clarity here, you've mentioned Andrew Bailey. What was his role at the Financial Conduct Authority?
He was the chief executive.
Thank you. In your opinion, to what extent did the FCA act promptly and effectively to prevent the alleged misconduct from continuing?
Well, as I said before, the conduct was over anyway, so that's not really relevant to this. Although I was fighting for recompense for the victims of the fraud.
If you suffered detriment or loss of job, what was the impact on your personal income in each of the 3 years after you blew the whistle compared to your income in the 3 years prior to your dismissal?
Well, it destroyed my life and my career. I mean, I was naive when I blew the whistle, thinking that by doing the right thing, I would be lauded and I'd be able to get a job anywhere. But that wasn't the case. In fact, it was extremely difficult, and it has been, it remains. I mean, I blew the whistle in 2006. So that was 15 years ago. And I haven't since had a proper job. I've had a couple of contract jobs, which came to an end. But it ruined my life. I mean, I even applied for a £13,000 a year call center job at a local insurance company, and I didn't get the job. And I challenged them. I said, you know, I can do this job. Why didn't I get? They said, because you revealed confidential information. I tried to work with all the major London law firms on a group action. One law firm did employ me for a period, and then they entered into a conflict of interest, which meant that we couldn't pursue the claim. No other firm would work with me, either because they had a conflict, they either banked with HSBC, or they acted for HSBC, or they wouldn't work with me because I blew the whistle. So it ruined my life completely. I'm still on benefits, and I'm still struggling to keep this house. I'm constantly struggling to pay the mortgage.
I believe that in your notes you put that you are a mortgage prisoner. Could you just briefly, for those that don't understand the term, explain what a mortgage prisoner is, please, Nicholas?
Well, mortgage prisoner, I originally took out my mortgage with Northern Rock, and as everybody knows, they collapsed and the government bought them out. And as a result of that, the government took over the mortgage book, or the bad mortgages. The good mortgages, so-called good mortgages, went to Richard Branson, but the bad mortgages were taken over by the government and then farmed out but were sold by the government to what are called non-active lenders. So my mortgage now is with an organization called Heliodor, who came into existence simply to mop up these mortgages. So they will have bought my mortgage probably at 10 pence in the pound, but they are pursuing me for the full interest on my mortgage at 4.1%. So I can't, the mortgage prisoner part comes in, I can't get a cheaper mortgage because I now won't comply with the affordability tests, which were in place after the financial crash. After all the things that broke Northern Rock, they brought in stricter controls. And because of that, I now, the joke is I can't afford a cheaper mortgage, and I'm stuck, and I can't even get equity release, I've discovered in the last couple of weeks. So that's caused my position.
In your opinion, how well or badly has the FCA treated you as a whistleblower? How well has it protected your privacy, ensured that your career was not adversely affected, and helped to safeguard your mental health?
Well, none of those things apply. One thing I don't think I've mentioned in my questionnaire, but the chief executive of HFC Bank, which is the main bank involved, 2 years ago, he took his own life because he thought he was going to prison. Because of the FCA investigation, because they did start investigating. After the £4 million, I went back to them, had another meeting with them and told them exactly how big it was. And he knew, his name was Adrian Hill, he knew how big it was himself. So he took his own life because he was worried about the consequences. I've been suicidal myself. Being a mortgage prisoner, living on the breadline constantly, whilst there's been no sanctions against anybody involved in this. I mean, quite the contrary, people have earned millions. The lawyers, I calculated the two law firms between them were adding £44 million a year in illegal charges. So I'd blown the whistle, and HSBC, the FCA basically gaslighted me, made me to feel the person that I was the one that was guilty. I had to provide the evidence. I had to prove what was going wrong when it was apparent. And as I said, there was already an order from the SRA and an order from the OFT, and it was all apparent. And I had all these Ministry of Justice records. At first, they refused to look at them because they said we can't authenticate where they came from. And I said, well, they're Ministry of Justice records. You can just marry them up with the Ministry of Justice. They just blocked me all the time. Even to this day, the full extent of that fraud hasn't been properly dealt with. It's still going on. I mean, not the fraud, but my campaign.
Nicholas, you've indicated that you've suffered financially as a result of blowing the whistle. How effective has the FCA been in securing redress for you from the guilty parties?
Not at all. It's never been mentioned. Unfortunately, in this country, whistleblowers don't receive the benefit they do in the United States. I mean, I would have received probably £40 million if I'd blown the whistle in America. But the FCA, no, they've shown no. The only one person there that has shown a slight sensitivity or perception of my situation has been the company secretary, Simon Pearce. But the others, the higher up people, no concern at all, nothing.
How effective has the FCA been in securing redress for the victims of the alleged misconduct and in prosecuting or banning the perpetrators so they are unable to continue doing it?
Well, as I said, the initial press release said that the HSBC had voluntarily, I mean, that wasn't by any order of the FCA, voluntarily agreed to repay £4 million. And that was to, I think, 6,700 people. Then 2 years later, in 2019, it was announced that they were going to pay another 18,500 people, which actually equates to, by that time, it was about £30 million. But I still knew that was, because I had always said it was at least £200 million. And if you take it back back to when HFC Bank first started trading in the UK, it would be over £1 billion. But because HSBC only purchased the bank in 2003, that's where I did my calculations from. So it was at least £200 million. And then earlier this year, it's been disclosed that in their accounts that they've set aside £223 million for these debt recovery matters. Now, there's been some debate in the press with Paul Lewis, Moneybox, and Martin Lewis of Supermarket or Money Expert. Nobody really quite knows what HSBC are repaying. They're sending out these mysterious payments. Nobody quite knows what's for. I'm hoping next month in November there will be an announcement of a big fine against HSBC, because the same thing happened with Barclays. And I think they allow the bank to make make payments of the redress to avoid claims management companies, and then they'll announce the fine, so there's no more money to be reclaimed. And so I'm hoping next month, because HSBC have said this redress scheme will end in November, which makes me think that's when the fine will be imposed. And maybe at that time, I might get a mention, but I can't be certain.
Nicholas, what do you believe the FCA could have done better in relation to your whistleblowing case?
Well, they should have investigated it, and they should have forcibly removed evidence from HSBC and the solicitors. As I said, Bailey denied that they had those powers. also, I mean, they were dishonest even with Parliament. Martin Wheatley told the Treasury Select Committee that the FCA doesn't have powers to prosecute for fraud. They do, and they do it all the time. But he said it. He said it verbally in a Treasury Select Committee meeting, and then he wrote to them confirming it. No, but they do have the powers. As far as I'm concerned, they just did what HSBC told them to do, and that's evidenced by that copy and paste letter and all the lies that have been perpetrated through to the media and via Treasury Select Committee and the FCA. They were protecting HSBC, and there's a reason. HSBC were under a deferred prosecution agreement in America. It wouldn't have been good to see £100 million fraud during that DPA. The FCA knew that.
Nicholas, if you don't mind, just to help those that aren't familiar with the term, could you explain, please, what a deferred prosecution arrangement is?
Well, in America, very briefly, they were caught out, HSBC were caught out laundering money for Mexican drug terrorists and Al-Qaeda and other terrorists. And in lieu of prosecuting them, this is quite common these days, the American Department of Justice agreed to do what's called a deferred prosecution agreement. So for 5 years, they agreed not to prosecute HSBC, provided they paid a fine of $1.9 billion, and provided they kept their noses clean for the 5 years of the duration of the deferred prosecution agreement. That's another long story because they certainly didn't, but that's what a deferred prosecution agreement is. And if I mean, if it had been announced that they were defrauding customers in Britain to the tune of £223 million during that period, it could have jeopardized their license in America. So the FCA had to defend them, protect them.
In general terms, what would you say about the FCA's effectiveness and timeliness in responding to your whistleblower situation?
Completely soul destroying, infuriating. I can't say any more. I mean, they're not a regulator for the banks. I mean, they do regulate small independent financial advisors, but they're not the big banks. I mean, they do occasionally, they do issue fines and so on. But in my case with HSBC, and I do think there's a special relationship with HSBC, it's the revolving door problem that we all know about.
What are your thoughts, Nicholas, on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers that it already has?
Well, I think it does have. I do think it does have the powers it needs. The Financial Markets Services Act, I think it's called. I mean, it's all in there, but they don't seem to know it. I mean, you know, these two things that they say they can't prosecute fraud and they can't raid offices. They can. It's all in the act, and there are many people that you and I know who know that act inside out, and the FCA don't. I mean, many people seem to know more about the FCA's powers than the FCA do. And the worst one is I think it's section 384 or 385, which is the one where they can hide behind it. They don't have to tell you anything because it's a criminal offense for them to reveal any information of their investigations. So they use that in every situation, not to tell you anything of the progress. They don't keep you informed of what's going on deliberately. It's not because they're being incompetent. They deliberately do not tell you what's going on. That's the policy.
In general terms, how would you describe what it's been like dealing with the FCA?
Dreadful. Dreadful. Nothing more I can say. I mean, there has been no experience I've had with them that has been satisfying.
What is your perception of the culture of the FCA? What do you think about it?
I think it's corrupt. I mentioned the revolving door problem, and it happens. I mean, if you looked at LinkedIn, there are so many crossovers between people that work at the FCA or work at HSBC, and they know, somebody working at the FCA knows that, you know, if they're paid 50,000 at the FCA, they know they could probably get a job at HSBC for twice that, and HSBC know that, and HSBC probably say to them, you better think about your future. I mean, and I think it's just launching pad for a job with one of the firms they regulate, and that's the problem. And I think there should be a law against the revolving door. For at least 5 years, these people aren't allowed to work at the regulated, and vice versa. That's my view.
Have you ever complained officially about the FCA? If so, to whom?
The Complaints Commissioner, yeah.
And the next question.
I did, and I don't know if I put this in there, but I did also report them to the Serious Fraud Office, but that was more in the spirit of having to do it than in any expectation of anything happening. But as far as I was concerned, because I think they're corrupt, I thought it should be looked at by the Serious Fraud Office. But of course, I was just brushed off. Sorry, I'm going to say.
That's fine, thank you. Overall, what have been the consequences to you, and if relevant to your family, as a result of what has happened?
Disastrous. I mean, it's destroyed my life, and it's alienated my friends and family. As many whistleblowers will tell you, I mean, it's very, very difficult to support a whistleblower through all the the thick and thin that they go through, and I think most whistleblowers will say they lose friends, they lose the family, trust of the family. I can't talk about this with my family. It's a taboo subject. Nobody's interested. I understand it's been going on for 19 years. I mean, 18 years. I understand that, but for for the whistleblower, for me personally, it's disastrous.
What would be your advice to somebody thinking about blowing the whistle to the FCA on a matter to do with misconduct in the financial services sector?
Well, I've said this publicly for a while now. I wouldn't recommend blowing the whistle in financial matters. If it's a matter of life and death, and you're working in a hospital or a building site, and somebody's life is in danger, then of course you must. But I would say in financial matters, don't do it, or at least, as in my case, don't do it unless you've got another job to go to. I didn't, thinking I would be a hero and would get another job straight away. But I say don't do it. You won't win. They will win. They will destroy you.
If you could change 3 things, Nicholas, about the FCA, what would they be?
I don't think they should be funded by the banks. I mean, that's obviously a conflict of interest. As I said, I think there should be a law about the revolving doors syndrome, in that somebody shouldn't go straight from HSBC to the FCA and vice versa, and they shouldn't be so secretive. I think they need to be much more transparent in their dealings and more open with the public to see what's going on. Otherwise, I mean, and clearly everybody believes they're acting in favor of the banks. If they're not, we need to see it, we need to know it, and we need to see it by the results of their investigations.
Nicholas, what positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to comment on?
None at all.
Next question. What do you think about the possibility of conflicts of interest issues at the FCA?
Well, as I said, it's the revolving door, and the bank being funded by the people they regulate, and the revolving door syndrome. That's a conflict of interest. And it should be legislated against. That's the major problem as far as I'm concerned.
Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the spot checks by VAT inspectors?
Yes, definitely, unannounced. I was told stories of when the auditors were visiting HFC Bank, the people were putting files in above the tiles in the ceiling, those white tiles. They remove them and hide files up there when the auditors were coming. So it should be done without notice and regularly.
The FCA is undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Not especially. I mean, I said no comment on my questionnaire. It'll be window dressing. I don't trust it. It needs a complete overhaul as far as I'm concerned.
And the final question, Nicholas, are there any other comments that you would like to make?
No, just to thank you and the Transparency Task Force and the APPG.
Nicholas, thank you very much indeed for taking the time and making the effort to provide your evidence by way of this video interview to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services in relation to its call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. Nicholas, thank you very, very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.